All right. So we've talked about how in order to progress from new resident to junior, from junior to senior, and then ultimately to be certified, residents need to get the green light from the competency committee. And the main data that the committee uses to make this assessment comes from EPAs. So let's talk now about what an EPA is. In this section, I'm going to explain what an EPA evaluation is, and more importantly, what your role is going to be in all of this. So to start, let me ask, what makes a resident competent? What exactly are those things on the list that I talked about? Well, the Royal College in 2015 came up with a list of all the things they think a competent fellow should be able to do. And this list had things in all of the different CanMeds domains, and the competencies they came up with were broken down and mapped onto specific stages of training where they thought the resident should be able to achieve it. And the really nice thing about all these competencies that they identified is that they've all been phrased in terms of things you can observe. And the term they've given to these observable markers of competence is milestones. So milestones are the fundamental observable markers of competence in residency education. They're specific to the various CanMeds domains, and they're also specific to the various stages of training. So, to reiterate, the competencies in CBD are effectively milestones. But as I mentioned, there are dozens of milestones. So how can we possibly assess them all individually? Well, this is what EPAs are for. EPAs, or Entrustable Professional Activities, are the fundamental units of evaluation in residency education. They are real-life tasks, the things that you do day to day, such as seeing consults or managing emergencies, and importantly, they require you to have met a couple of milestones at the same time to do them competently. From a practical standpoint, EPAs are sort of like baskets that bundle a bunch of milestones together that allows us to assess them all at once. And because EPAs are real clinical tasks, the way you evaluate them is simple. You just ask, could this trainee do this task if I were not here? So practically speaking, EPAs change this into this. So rather than evaluate 100 little details individually, like you might do all at once on an ITER, instead you make an overall judgment about the level of independence a resident can be trusted with on specific clinical tasks. And you do that over and over and over and over and over, so that residents are getting evaluations in a mix of settings, under direct observation, under indirect observation, with staff, with seniors, and they're doing this continuously through their training. And yes, this is a change in how evaluations are done, but the big change, the part where you play a key role, is that the resident is now getting very specific, very directed, formal feedback all the way through their training. All right, so you've been asked to do an EPA evaluation. So how does that work logistically? A resident is going to come up to you and ask you to do an EPA for them. Now, sometimes this will require direct observation with you watching them seeing a patient, and sometimes it's simply going to require you to evaluate them based on a case presentation. So after you observe the learner, either in the room with the patient or by listening to their presentation, you're expected to provide feedback and fill out an EPA form. Now, the forms can be found on 145, so make your way to the nearest computer, go to 145. I find that Googling DAL 145 is often the easiest way to get there. And once you're in 145, you need to send yourself an EPA form. So this can be done from the main page by clicking the EPA you want to send in the Forms to Send section, right here. That will take you to a screen where you can select the resident you're evaluating, and then back on this main page, after you've selected the resident, the EPA form will then appear down here in the Forms to Complete section. Now, you click that form, and you're going to be brought to this page. At the top of the form will be information explaining what the EPA is evaluating and some of the details that you're looking for. This is probably worth reading over the first time that you do an EPA. Moving down, the first two questions will just simply log what sort of encounter it was. So, was this a direct observation or an indirect observation? And what was the patient's chief complaint? Next, you're going to be asked to provide an entrustability rating. So this is that global assessment that you need to provide on how much support the resident needed. So, did you need to step in and take over? Or could the resident have done the task completely independently? Or perhaps something in between? It's important here that you use the full scale. It's totally expected that a resident on her first day of residency is not going to be able to do certain tasks unsupervised. So saying that she could do a task independently when she can't is not doing her any favors. At the same time, keep in mind that EPAs are stage specific. So while a junior resident should be able to, for example, handle a straightforward case of pneumonia independently before progressing, it would be inappropriate to expect them to manage a complex or a rare presentation without guidance. So use the full scale. This helps residents progress as they go through residency, but keep in mind that EPAs are specific for the stage of training. So moving down, now is your opportunity to provide feedback. So the next thing on the form is a list of every milestone that goes into the EPA. And these are those observable competencies that a resident needs to be able to do to handle an EPA competently. So to help articulate your feedback, you can select specific milestones that you think the resident could improve. For residents who are at a low entrustability rating, this part is mandatory. But for even for residents who have achieved competence, you can check off milestones to give focused feedback on what you think they need to do to get to the next level. Finally, at the very bottom of the form, you need to provide some details on your assessment. So this is where you can include specific feedback on the resident's performance as it relates to those milestones that you just checked off. It's also where you can give a brief description of your plan that you've come up with the trainee to help improve next time. So when you're doing this, try to be very specific because it helps the competency committee use these comments to assess the resident's trajectory. The final question is simply a special field that usually wouldn't be relevant. This is where you can report red flags that are related to professionalism or patient safety. And that's it for the logistics. So now you're filling in these comments and you're giving feedback. How do you make sure your feedback is good? This leads us to the final portion of this tutorial, how to give good feedback.